I just wanted to go ahead and give you content warnings before we jump into this week's episode. Topics include and are not limited to mentions of QAnon, racism, slavery, and plantation-era slave ownership, online stalking, online harassment, legal harassment, doxing, dogpiling, and there's some bathroom humor at the end of the episode. If any of those aren't suitable for you or just maybe not the vibe for today, that is totally okay. Go ahead and pass this one over. Thank you so much, and let's jump into the episode. Welcome in. Come on through the door. Welcome into Author's Note.
Take a seat.
Tease, what's the subtitle? Tease, what's the subtitle?
Oh, don't listen. I was too busy making little sound effects for you taking a step into the office.
Doing Foley for our little podcast opener. Hello, and welcome to Author's Note.
Don't listen.
My name is Cass.
And my name's Tease.
Tease.
Yeah?
Have you partaken in anything delicious this week?
I read half of the book, and I played the literal first 15 minutes of Resident Evil 8. That's it.
How'd it go?
I died.
And you know, when you die in a video game, that's it. That's done. You can't play it again.
Exactly.
You have to return it.
That's why I rage quit Tulip 2 months ago, and I still haven't gone back to it. Because I died.
I didn't know about that.
I mean, it wasn't a rage quit, but like I did die, and I was like, oh, fuck this. I don't want to spend money on another train ticket in this game. And I just kind of silently closed it. So I have to go back to it. I miss it.
Rest in fucking pieces, Tulip.
He got hit by a little man who lived in the graveyard.
That was me.
Oh, it was you. Okay. But Cass, what about you? Have you watched, consumed anything fun at all this week?
No.
Nice. I bought a lot of books this week, but
yeah.
I haven't read them.
You read half of a book, and I read the whole book, and we didn't need to even read it for this episode.
No, but I think, should we tell people what we're thinking about doing?
Oh, yes. Stay tuned for a fun little book club episode, because we both read Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice.
And that means, after that, if Cass reads Dune, we'll do Dune. Where's my spice?
We will. I have a physical copy of Dune now. I will read it. I will get to it.
Congratulations.
I'm excited to read it. I really love the cover.
It's good.
And
we have that copy too. Yeah.
It was prodigious that I went and bought it, because literally as I walked into the bookstore that I go to, the clerks were talking about Dune, and I just kind of sighed and picked it up, and they were like, speaking of Dune.
So, Cass, what are we talking about today?
Tease,
yeah.
When you've been reading fan fiction,
yeah.
Have you ever come across fic that starts with a disclaimer to the extent of, I don't own these characters, I'm not making any profit off of this, please don't sue me?
Yes.
Have you ever wondered why that happened?
Is it because of Miss Anne Rice herself?
It is a little bit because of Miss Anne Rice herself.
Oh.
Yeah, Anne Rice did some really interesting things to the landscape of fandom in general.
Okay.
I think especially newer people coming into fandom spaces just aren't familiar with this aspect of the history of it, and how scary it was in ye olden days, the threat of like a lawsuit and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So we both obviously read Interview with the Vampire because I think coming into this, we weren't sure how much the content of those books influenced the way Anne Rice felt about the fandom, or like what the fandom was writing about. I did find that unilaterally, Anne Rice just didn't like fan fiction being written at all. And like, we'll get into the particulars of that. And we obviously, we're gonna do a bonus episode. It'll be on Patreon for all members, $1 and up, just talking about Interview with the Vampire, because it is a fascinating book and really interesting. Have you read Anne Rice before this, Tease?
No, I have not.
What is your impression of her as a writer? Or I guess prior to reading, what was your impression of what Anne Rice's writing would be?
I assumed it was soft erotica, truth be told, because I knew that Interview with the Vampire, there was a lot of like sexual tension between characters, and then I've seen Queen of the Damned, and that's like big sexy, obviously. So I was like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, there's probably this like weird charged energy throughout these books. I'd assume on my quest craving for werewolf romance, a friend actually recommended me one of her werewolf series that she has, but I never picked it up. And
Mm-hmm.
I kind of figured it was kind of like the same way like The Outsiders was, in a way where it's like, no, they're not gay, but they are gay. They're not gay, but maybe they are. But your author will sue you. Like, I knew Anne Rice was really protective of her characters, but that's about as far as it went for me. I didn't realize that, like, her writing was so flowery and very Dickens-esque, truth be told.
Yeah, that was my immediate impression. I went into this expecting the books to be bodice rippers.
Yes,
and
me
they very
too.
much aren't.
No.
They are incredibly Dickensian in her voice and style of writing, and there was part of me that got almost mad about the public perception and portrayal of her writing, because it's like it's very frustrating to see the way women authors are talked about in comparison to male authors, and how a lot of times like women authors get like they get devalued and their work gets passed off as like, you know, flowery or, you know, as being poor because it is like erotica or things like that. And it's like, listen, at least they can write sex scenes.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't think negatively of her work being flowery. Like, I just see it, like, listen, I read fan fiction. There are people in fan fiction who do not know how to edit a sentence to save their life. And so I didn't think necessarily bad on it. I feel like I was like, damn, I should have known she's writing about saucy little 1700s vampires with their little cravats and little French attitudes, you know. I should have known that her writing would be so
verbose.
I don't want to say like I never could say this word right. Superfluous.
Yes.
But I guess ostentatious would also be a good word. But I didn't expect it, you know.
I think there's something funny, right, where it's like she does list Dickens as like one of her key inspirations, and she abides a lot by his rules of writing. But Dickens was also being paid by the word. So like
he sure was.
That's part of why he had such long flowing sentences. I did see a critique at one point of her writing as being imprecise, and that was one of the things I noticed, is that like she very rarely seems to want to just like write an action. It's like she has to write everything surrounding that action instead of just being like, Louis walked to the door.
Yeah, I think this, I don't want to like give spoilers. We shouldn't be talking about this much at length, but there was a scene where I was like, girl, did you just eat a rat that was crawling around in a wall, or did you like just really have a spiritual experience? Like, what is it?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Like, just tell me, Anne, please. I'm begging of you.
So that's our little preview. But I think we're gonna end up talking too about a lot of the like very overt homoeroticism and homoromanticism that is in the book, and you cannot deny it, in bonus episode. But for now, let's get into the episode proper.
Yeehaw.
If you are in some way, shape, or form, you know, we have like a baseline level of knowledge that I think we expect most people to come to this podcast with, in terms of like your understanding of fandom and fan spaces and knowing those terms. But if you don't know who Anne Rice is, totally understandable. She is the best-selling writer of the Vampire Chronicles, among other titles like The Wayfair Witches or Mayfair Witches. It's one of those.
I think it's the Mayfair Witches, because Wayfair...
Wayfair, you got just what I need.
Was somewhere a marketing exec is like, yes, yes.
QAnon is like Anne Rice. Anne Rice has the adrenochrome. It's how she looks so young. Anne Rice is the best-selling author of the Vampire Chronicles, among other titles. She has gone by the pseudonyms Anne Rampling and A.N. Roquelaire, or Roquelaire. Rice's career as a professional writer began with Interview with the Vampire, which released in 1976, and this actually surprised me. This was her first novel, and it was adapted from a previous short story that she had written. Anne's agent sold the rights to Interview to Knopf for $12,000 as an advance when most new writers at that time were only getting $2,000. Like, this was her first novel and her first major publication, which is just wild to me that her agent was able to strike that kind of deal. The book received quite a bit of negative reception that actually caused her to retreat from the supernatural genre in general. Rice writes in a quite Dickensian voice about things that are really campy, and it is really odd and at odds with itself, but it's weird because sometimes it feels like it takes itself too seriously, but she's also writing from a very gothic and romantic perspective in the traditional senses of it. So it all kind of tangles together to work in an odd way that it almost shouldn't. The Vampire Chronicles is itself a series of books chiefly following the vampire Lestat and the stories that surround him. So the first book comes out in 1976, and then the film adaptation featuring Brad Pitt as Louis and Tom Cruise as Lestat releases in 1994. The sequels, the book sequels, The Vampire Lestat releases in 1985, and the book The Queen of the Damned releases in 1988. And then those sort of get messily jammed together into one movie that's released in 2002 called Queen of the Damned, where they recast Lestat with Stuart Townsend. I think it's Stuart Townsend. I think Harry Townsend is a video game character. But it featured Aaliyah in her last on-screen performance. It is a weird movie, and it is so very different from Interview. But they're both sort of odd movies. They're both quite campy. How gay would you say Interview with the Vampire is, T, so far?
Pretty gay.
Yeah, it gets gayer too.
Oh my god, the longing. Oh, I won't get into it, but
the characters two men explicitly communicate their love for each other multiple times. There are also some interesting threads. I'll get into that in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
But the Vampire Chronicles have long been held with a lot of love by the queer community. Vampires in general, a lot of supernatural creatures, if we're being totally honest, but vampires in general can usually be read as allegorical symbols of social othering and isolation that queer people face. But Rice's vampires in particular struggle deeply with their own morality and their relationship to the world and human beings around them. Interview in specific really fixates around Louis, the main character's struggle of, having lost a brother who wanted to be a part of the clergy, and he himself is quite religious, and his questioning of whether or not he's a damned creature because he's been made into a vampire and what that means for him. Like, is he literally living in hell now as a vampire? It is all very annoying to read. I'll be honest.
It's kind of like, it kind of just boils down to, is it gay to suck somebody's neck? Like...
Well, and that's the thing. It really reads as a gay man struggling with his own internalized homophobia and identity. It is it's shocking how straight people can accidentally stumble into writing these things,
Yeah.
In a 2012 interview with NPR, Rice actually said, "From the beginning, I've had gay fans and gay readers who felt that my works involved a sustained gay allegory. I didn't set out to do that, but that was what they perceived." Which, yeah, I mean, I don't know that, I don't know that perceived is necessarily fair, because it's you might not have set out to write a gay story, but you very much did. And there's, one of the things we'll come back to is that the continued aggression between fans and Anne Rice is, her claims as to how deliberate she is in her writing versus, the things that are deliberately in there, it seems that she won't admit to. I think it's worth noting, I believe her son is gay. He was on a cover for The Advocate and is, he does a lot of work with LGBTQ charities, and she does as well in speaking up about that. So listen, I might not have some favorable opinions about Anne Rice when it comes to fandom, but she doesn't seem like a terrible person.
We also spoke to somebody who actually worked with Anne Rice. I don't want to obviously give any information broadly or give out the identity of this person. However, the consensus on Anne Rice seems to be that she has her good days and she has her bad days just like anybody else, She's somebody who's fiercely protective of her characters, and she has relationships that may be off-putting to people, but also they're personal to her too. You know, it's just like anybody else that has a life outside of their public viewing. So I think that's where we could just leave it at her as a person.
Yeah, exactly. I am not here necessarily to debate the intricacies of Anne Rice's personal life. That's none of our business.
Yep.
Fan fiction and fan works, I think we can both agree, generally rise out of a desire for representation.
Yeah.
People want to see themselves in the worlds that they love, and that's not always necessarily in a self-inserty way, but they just want to see, like, a nugget of themselves in that world and, like, how it would be handled. And it's also worth noting, and we can talk about this more during book club time, but the first book is both explicitly racist, and the movie keeps with that, and I think in some ways actually makes it much worse. So, like, Anne Rice is a 79-year-old white woman who was raised in a Christian household and became a born-again Christian in the aughts and left organized religion later, but she still speaks to her love of Christ, and, like, those are worth noting when we talk about these books. I could not find any statements from her, however, addressing the racism of her books. And I don't mean that it's like, I mean, Louis is quite literally a plantation owner with slaves, and, like, these slaves are a core aspect of, like, what moves the plot forward initially in the beginning. So,
like, Lestat purposely kills the slaves because he knows that they won't be missed as much either and stuff like that.
Exactly.
Like,
and there's even more than that. It's just
not a good look, no.
We will talk about a lot of this more in book club time. There are some themes in the book that are really interesting and worrisome and worth dissecting, you know?
Yes, agreed.
So if you're interested in checking out these books, you know, like, obviously go into it aware that, like, there is some very difficult content in there. The big issue, though, with Anne Rice and fan works, though, is that she hated them. And she still doesn't super love them. But she absolutely hated them. And before we get into her reasoning why her interactions with fans, I think we need to talk about why authors in general are quite wary of fan fiction.
Please do. Tell me more.
Yeah. You know, this is a little bit different, right? Because, like, right now we are living in an era where there are tons of huge name published authors who are now a part of literary canon, right? That, like, their work was fan fiction. Cassandra Clare wrote fan fiction. The Shadow Hunters Shadowhunters was a Harry Potter fan fiction. E.L. James wrote, 50 Shades of Grey as a Twilight fan fiction. And there's numerous other examples. Like, I read The Scottish Boy, a few months back, and, like, that was a Stucky fan fiction for Captain America. So we are seeing more and more this transition. Who is the director or the writer who just won at the Oscars and she came out saying she writes fan fiction?
Chloe Zhang?
Yeah.
Chloe Zhang?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I don't know how to properly pronounce her last name. I apologize to anybody who's screaming at me right now.
She writes fan fiction. It just came out it didn't just come out, but fans rediscovered that the lead artist behind Ace Attorney wrote doujinshi, and so, like, a lot of the designs were based on, like, tropes of, like, gay erotica and manga, We are living in an era where, like, fan fiction is talked about. It did not used to be that way.
It exists.
It very much used to not be that way.
That's even, like, how cosplay has kind of grown too. Like, people just will refer to the word cosplay now to refer to other things. And
well, I mean, it's very popular for celebrities to be streaming and cosplay for fun.
Yep,
And, like,
it's a different world. It is a different world.
A huge reason why authors are really wary of fanfiction comes back to the late Marion Zimmer Bradley, whose name you will sometimes see abbreviated to MZB. She wrote the Darkover series and contributed to the Mists of Avalon series, and she became embroiled in this, like, huge fanfiction controversy. This could have its own episode, so I'm just going to give us the skinny of it, which is that a fan's fanfiction basically made it impossible for her to publish one of her own novels because there were so many similarities to things that, like, she had maybe already planned for. like, facts have changed and, like, shifted because of so many retellings of this. There's debate over, like, how much of that book was actually written. Like, had she not even started it? Had she been working on it for years? We don't really totally conclusively know. If you are interested and want us to do a whole episode on that, hit us up. Let us know. I think it would be a really fun time. But essentially, there was a fan fiction that she was in some way, shape, or form familiar with, and it made it impossible for her to publish her book because she was so worried about essentially being sued by the fan fiction author, which is a really interesting tangle, right? Because, like, the fan fiction creator is using her property and has, in a weird fashion, taken it away from her.
Mm-hmm.
That story, though, has been used to caution a lot of authors on receiving gifts of fan work, engaging with fans, and has even been used as an excuse to condemn fan works. Like, George R.R. Martin really doesn't want to engage with fan work. He's made some statements on it that I don't totally agree with about, like, the diluting of his property by the creation of fan work, which is just like, George, you were a part of LiveJournal and the fan work scene, so, like, calm down. The Dragon Riders of Pern, the author of those, had, like, specific rules that were written up and are still hosted on her website about, you know, what you have to do when you're writing fan fiction, which is like, you can't you can't do that. I mean, you can, but, like, you can't control it. One of the things was like, no erotica or porn. I'm a grandmother. And I was like, that's some wishful thinking. It's also worth noting here, because I don't think enough people acknowledge this as well, is that fan works aren't necessarily legal or illegal, but currently exist in a gray legal area. We haven't had a case in which a published author has taken a fanfiction writer to court, though lawsuits have been threatened, and so we don't actually have legal precedent for this at this time. I think a lot of us carry over our grade school knowledge, right, of, like, legality, and think that law is, like, a series of yes and no answers, and it's like, it's very much not that. It is like, things have to kind of go to court and be decided and litigated and argued against, and, like, maybe that'll give us an answer for the future, but then maybe that'll get overturned. It's a whole wild thing.
It's messy.
And it is largely agreed now that fan fiction is protected under the caveats of derivative and transformative works. But the law is fickle, and the world is ever-changing. For those reasons, among others, that's why it's really important for you as a fan to be respectful and not try to push headcanons, your fan fiction, your speculative fan art at published and working creators. It can very quickly and publicly muddy the waters for them and make things very difficult for them. And, like, please understand, too, that, like, if you are a person who has written fan fiction of something and you want to share it with the author and they don't want to see it, it's not an indication that, like, they don't like you or they don't like fan fiction, but it is literally them trying to protect themselves. Mm-hmm. So it's like, that is a way that you can be a better fan. But that has become a lot more difficult in the advent of social media, because it's really hard for creators to dodge those things now if they do want to have a line of communication with their fans and be on social media. Because, like, even if they aren't explicit about the fact that it's, like, let's say Brian Fuller was on Twitter in stealth, you know, like, people would still find out that it's him and, like, still hit him up talking about Hannibal all the time, or American Gods, or what have you. So it's just, Twitter has ruined everything. It's just one other, like, facet of this, like, weird dynamic and imbalance of power between creators and fans. And, like, sometimes that power lies more with the fans than it does with the creators. And, like, I do think there's something that's a little bit worrying about that. And, like, there's, like, a whole debate and discussion to be had about even the idea of, like, idea theft. Because, like, it's real, you know, like, you might not be able to charge for it, but, like, it's a real thing that happens. Fandom used to be really secretive, and, like, you didn't talk about it, like, not even at convention spaces, unless you were among people who you also knew were engaged with fan works. Like, you didn't talk about it with creators, but now it's like, yeah, I'm gonna go to the panel and, like, ask them to sign my fan fiction that I printed out, which, you do you.
Chase your bliss.
Yeah. If you haven't noticed already, this is another Cass talking heavy episode.
I love it.
Tease will return to us next week.
Next week.
So, drama within Rice fanfiction spaces began long before, but we're going to start with Anne's statement on her website from the year 2000, which is still up today, and reads,
I do not allow fanfiction. The characters are copyrighted. It upsets me terribly to even think about fanfiction with my characters. I advise my readers to write your own original stories with your own characters. It is absolutely essential that you respect my wishes. Girl.
absolutely essential.
You wish people would actually fucking read and actually respect people's requests online.
Mm-hmm.
God. How dare she? How dare she even ask people to respect her wishes? That it's essential. They're copywritten.
There is always in Anne Rice's correspondence a level of haughtiness and I think maybe unintentional egotism. Or maybe intentional egotism. I don't know. The person who we corresponded with did disclose that, like, there were occasions where, like, she was incredibly polite, But, like, I also, as somebody with characters, I think pretty much any creator can understand this aspect of, like, wanting to retain some control over your characters and, like, being really wary about other people writing them,
Yeah. One time somebody said that they kinned one of my characters and I almost freaked out.
There's, there's an interesting thing there, right? Is like, okay, let's talk about Lestat, because, like, Lestat is Anne Rice's baby. And that's understandable,
Yeah.
Tease, you're making a face, but
no,
Lestat
I was making eye contact with myself in the window, and I had a moment where, like, I looked into the camera, like I was in the office, because I was making eye contact with myself. I'm sorry. I'm like a bird who sees themselves in a mirror.
So Lestat, let's say, is Anne Rice's comfort OC. Right? And so there is an understanding there that, like, Lestat is very personal to Anne Rice. But Lestat's story is publicly accessible to people in the form of these books, in a way that, like, if you are just a random artist on the internet with, like, an OC that you draw every now and again, like, chances are people don't know their whole story. And so, like, there is something that is a little bit more invasive about people, running to you and writing fan fiction about your character who they clearly don't know or understand because you haven't publicized any of their story. Lestat's story is publicized and accessible and can be read and interpreted by many different people. And I'm not saying that makes it okay for people to claim ownership of him, because I don't really agree with people being like, your character is mine now. And it's like, okay, no, just do what the rest of us do. Steal them and rename them. But you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
I do.
It is all well and good to politely ask your fans to not write fan fiction. It is a totally different thing to stalk them online and pretty much eradicate the presence of fan fiction for your works from the internet. This is a whole different thing. It's a whole new can of worms.
It sure is.
So if we backpedal a little bit, in 1995, when Rice used a mailing list to communicate with her fans, she had a firm rule against what were called specs. Specs is short for speculative fiction, and within the Vampire Chronicles and Anne Rice fan spaces, it was understood pretty much immediately to mean fan fiction. Specs were first posted to the Usenet group alt.books.ann-rice, or ABAR, or ABAR for short. And ABAR was an online fan group for Anne Rice, and up until 2000, that site hosted a fiction archive of all those specs that had been written. But then in 2000, right, the Angel Fire site Croatoan Fanfic published an essay titled, "Where Has Anne Rice Fanfiction Gone?" It explained to its visitors that after Anne Rice's statement, her and her team began harassing and threatening any and all fanfic writers of her work that they came across. Allegedly, the harassing emails included threats against individual businesses that these people owned. They included personal, private details that had been dug up from across the internet. I mean, these were highly inappropriate emails that also then came slapped with cease and desist letters. Tumblr user TBQ, who we'll come back to a lot because they've shared quite a bit of what happened during all this, wrote,
I discovered that someone in Anne's camp had been cyber stalking me to the point where they took all the tiny crumbs of personal information I had posted over the course of 5 years or so and used it to dox me. And post very personal information about me on the main fandom message board of the time. That's a nightmare. Holy shit.
Yeah.
That's awful. Oh my god.
And I mean, this Tumblr user went on to recount the fact that, like, they are still incredibly careful about what they share on the internet now because of that one incident that happened now 21 years ago. And, like, totally understandable. That's traumatizing to suddenly have, like, your very personal information just aired out there for everyone. And, like, you don't know.
Especially on such, like, a huge platform, too. Because that's not just, like, some random person's blog with a vendetta against you. That is a artist. Like, that is a writer and author that you follow and care about, and other people are reading this person's blog because they also care about this this series, this content, you know. And for a author to be like, this person wrote fan fiction, I'm gonna tell you their social security number, like, that's fucked up. That's fucked up.
It began this whole wave of, like, harassing fanfiction writers and condemning fan works in general because it upset Anne Rice. This then becomes further complicated by the fact that many of those writers and creators who were being sent cease and desist and who were being harassed were actually working with and for Anne Rice. And we will come back to that because it gets so messy.
Yikes.
On May 18th, 2001, Rice's lawyer sent a letter to fanfiction.net. The letter insisted that the fanfiction hosted there was copyright infringement and that, quote, we must insist that fanfiction.net immediately refrain from making available over the internet or otherwise any work based on any element of the property, including, without limitation, the above listed characters. It is essential that you confirm immediately by email that fanfiction.net has complied with the foregoing. If we do not receive the foregoing reassurance from you by the close of business on Monday, May 21st, 2001, we will have no choice but to advise fanfiction.net's internet server of this matter and to ask such server to take appropriate action.
And it's not that deep. What do you mean? Like, I know in theory there's always an address attached to, like, the person who owns the domain name or whatever, but, like, Anne Rice's lawyer just is like, I'm going to send a letter to fanfiction.net.
Well, and remember, like, right now, fan works are still morally gray, but, like, even back then, there was no team working actively to protect transformative works like we have now with the Internet Archive, you know?
Yeah.
So, I mean, back then, if the internet service provider who is hosting the server for fanfiction.net could have received a cease and desist and just been like, okay, and wiped everything on that website out. Just overnight.
Goodbye.
On May 20th, 2001, the entire category of Anne Rice Vampire Chronicles was removed from fanfiction.net. We don't know how many fics in that category just vanished overnight, but if they weren't saved or archived elsewhere, they are completely gone. Fanfiction.net literally used to have Anne Rice's name in their guidelines about authors whose works you couldn't write about. Like, there was just a whole list, and it was like, you can't write about anything that Anne Rice has done. I did, in reading all this, discover my favorite comment ever, which was, what is it with female authors of sexy vampire books that makes them act like their lead character is their secret boyfriend who will be cheating on them if he makes an appearance in someone else's story?
That's really how it feels.
Lestat's not gonna fuck you.
Sorry, Anne. He's not real.
If Anne Rice doesn't like something you wrote, including an Amazon review, she is going to fight you about it. She is 100% an old white lady on the internet. And I also found out that in 1996, Anne Rice straight up put up a reporter's phone number on her personal fan phone line, telling fans to go yell at him on her behalf because he posted a, quote, vicious piece about her purchasing a local chapel in the Times-Picayune. And this phone message that fans could access was also transcribed and put onto her website. This is not the first instance of Anne being involved with the Times-Picayune that we will get to, because there's a far funnier one later. I again want to restate that, like, this all happened quite a while ago, and like when we get to the end, you know, we'll talk a little bit about how Anne Rice has revised her positions on some of these things, but like the history of all of this is just so petty and hysterical to me.
It's so...
And also sad.
It kind of feels like, what's the rich girl from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory? Veruca Salt? Yeah.
Violet Beauregard?
No, Violet Beauregard's the one who turns into a blueberry because you're turning violet. I'm talking about Veruca Salt.
Veruca Salt.
And you know how Veruca's like, well, I want it now. And then she gets pissy if, like, anybody even breathes towards it. Like, that's how kind of Anne Rice is, you know? It's like, well, what do you mean you think you could write fan fiction? They are my characters. Like, oh my God. Like, girl, the world is not shaped and molded around Lestat. He is just an overgrown OC that people thought his dick should get wet. Like, guess what, girl? It could happen to anybody, not just you.
I think it's also worth talking about, I didn't include this in the show notes because, like, I didn't want to get too into it, but, like, she wrote, I can't even call it historical fiction because we're not totally certain about Jesus, but she wrote what her fans love to call Jesus fan fiction and published it, and so people constantly used that to, like, poke fun at her, being like, oh, you hate fan fiction? You wrote Jesus fan fiction.
Oh my God. Wait, what do you mean it's Jesus fan fiction? What happens?
I don't know if it gets sexy. I haven't read it.
Meet Jesus?
No, this is separate from the Vampire. This is separate from Vampire Chronicles.
Okay, thank God.
Although Lestat meeting Christ would be absolutely hysterical.
I mean, apparently he goes to Atlantis in 2016, so I didn't even read the summary of the book, so that may just be a metaphor. I don't know.
There is a very old and iconic line in fan spaces that you hadn't heard, but I have heard before, which is, you are interrogating the text from the wrong perspective. As a reader, you bring with you your own perspective to anything you engage with, and no two people will have the exact same perspectives, as their lives are different, and so therefore their experiences are different, and therefore their reading of any text is going to be different, which is a huge part of, like, why all readings of a text, you know, hold some inherent validity. But Anne Rice thinks that's stupid as hell. So in September 2004, there was a big buzz on Amazon about Anne Rice's book Blood Canticle. People did not like this book, and Anne was very upset about this. So, dear listener, I ask you now to put on a seatbelt as Teese reads for us Miss Anne Rice's 5-page response to the reviewers on Amazon.
Everybody, please keep your hands inside of the cart at all times during the ride, please. Let me take a sip.
Amazon has provided us with complimentary bottles if you need to pee at any point in time during
Thank
this.
you.
Jeff Bezos will be at the end so you can pat his bald turtle head.
Just give it a good slap like you would a bag of rice. From the author to the sum of the negative voices here. September 6th, 2004. Seldom do I really answer those who criticize my work. In fact, the entire development of my career has been fueled by my ability to ignore denigrating and trivializing criticism as I realize my dreams and my goals. However, there is something compelling about Amazon's willingness to publish just about anything, and the sheer outrageous stupidity of many things you've said here that actually touches my proletarian and democratic soul. Also, I use and enjoy Amazon, and I do read the reviews of other people's books in many fields. In sum, I believe in what happens here, and so I speak. First of all, let me say that this is addressed only to some of you who have posted outrageously negative comments here, and not to all. You are interrogating this text from the wrong perspective. Indeed, you aren't even reading it. You are projecting your own limitations on it, and you are giving a whole new meaning to the words wide readership. And you have strained my Dickensian principles to the max. I'm justifiably proud of being read by intellectual giants and waitresses in trailer parks. In fact, I love it. But who in the world are you? Now, on to the book. Allow me to point out, nowhere in this text are you told that this is the last of the Chronicles. Nowhere are you promised curtain calls or a finale. Nowhere are you told there will be a wrap-up of all the earlier material. The text tells you exactly what to expect, and it warns you specifically that if you did not enjoy Monarch the Devil, you may not enjoy this book. This book is by and about a hero whom many of you have already rejected, and he tells you that you are likely to reject him again. And this book is most certainly written, every word of it, by me. If and when I can't write a book on my own, you'll know about it. And no, I have no intention of allowing any editor ever to distort, cut, or otherwise mutilate sentences that I have edited and re-edited and organized and polished myself. I fought a great battle to achieve a status where I did not have to put up with editors making demands on me, and I will never relinquish that status. For me, novel writing is a virtuoso performance. It is not a collaborative art. Back to the novel itself. The character who tells the tale is my Lestat. I was with him more closely than I have ever been in this novel. His voice was as powerful for me as I've ever heard it. I experienced breakthrough after breakthrough as I walked with him, moved with him, saw through his eyes. What I ask of Lestat, Lestat unfailingly gives. For me, 3 hunting scenes, 2 which take place in hotels, the lone woman waiting for the hitman, the slaughter at the pimp's party, and the late night foray into the slums, stand with any similar scenes in all of the Chronicles. They can be read aloud without a single hitch. Every word is in perfect place. The short chapter in which Lestat describes his love for Rowan Mayfair was for me a totally realized poem. There are other such scenes in this book. You don't get all this? Fine. But I experienced an intimacy with the character and those scenes that shattered all prior restraints, and when one is writing, one does have to continuously and courageously fight a destructive tendency to inhibition and restraint. Getting really close to the subject matter is the achievement of only great art. Now, if it doesn't appeal to you, fine. You don't enjoy it? Read somebody else. But your stupid, arrogant assumptions about me and what I am doing are slander. And you have used the site as if it were a public urinal to publish falsehood and lies. I'll never challenge your democratic freedom to do so, and yes, I'm answering you, but for what it's worth, be assured of the utter contempt I feel for you, especially those of you who post anonymously and perhaps repeatedly, and how glad I am that this book is the last one in a series that has invited your hateful and ugly responses. Now, to return to the narrative in question. Lestat's wanting to be a saint is a vision larded through and through with his characteristic vanity. It connects perfectly with his earlier ambitions to be an actor in Paris, a rock star in the modern age. If you can't see that, you aren't reading my work. In his conversation with the Pope, he makes observations on the times which are in continuity with his observations on the late 20th century in the Vampire Lestat, and in continuity with Marius's observations in that book and later in Queen of the Damned. The state of the world has always been an important theme in the Chronicles. Lestat's comments matter. Every word he speaks is part of an achievement of this book. That Lestat renounced the saintly ambition within a matter of pages is plain enough for you to see. That he reverts to his old self is obvious, and that he intends to complete the tale of Blackwood Farm is also quite clear. There are many other themes and patterns in this work that I might mention. The interplay between Saint Juan Diego and Lestat, the invisible creature who doesn't exist in the eyes of the world, is a case in point. There's also the theme of the snare of Blackwood Farm, the place where human existence becomes so beguiling that Lestat relinquishes his power as if to a spell. The entire relationship between Lestat and Uncle Julian is carefully worked out, but I leave it to readers to discover how this complex and intricate novel establishes itself within a unique, if not unrivaled, series of books. There are things to be said, and there is a pleasure to be had, and readers will say wonderful things about Blood Canticle, and they already are. There are readers out there, and plenty of them, who cherish the individuality of each of the chronicles which you so flippantly condemn. They can and do talk circles around you, and I am warmed by their response. Their letters, the papers they write in school, our face-to-face exchanges on the road. These things sustain me when I read the utter trash that you post. But I feel I have said enough. If this reaches one reader who's curious about my work and shocked by the ugly reviews here, I served my goals. And yo, you dude, the slang police. Lestat talks like I do. He always has, and he always will. You really wouldn't much like being around either one of us, and you don't have to be. If any of you want to say anything about all of this, by all means, email me at AnnO'BrienRice@mac.com. And if you want your money back for the book, send it to address redacted. I'm not a coward about my real name or where I live. And yes, the Chronicles are no more. Thank God. Thank you.
We unlocked the secret. It's Comic Sans.
It's Comic Sans. Fuck.
That whole treatise is why we don't reply to YouTube comments, if ever. I don't want to accidentally do that.
I know, I'll be like, oh, whoops, sorry, thanks for telling us. Like, that's the most I'll say.
Yeah. YouTube commenters, we see you. Thank you very much. It means the world to us. But also, we are scared of becoming Anne Rice. So, I think my response to that, right, is that, like, if people don't understand your book, sometimes that will happen. You know, like, it just happens. You can't account for every single reader. But if people are consistently misunderstanding your book or, like, not pulling any of the things you're aiming for away from it, that's probably more so a failing by you as the storyteller. She acknowledges here that she does write in a very Dickensian fashion. And, like, again, I just want to bring up, Dickens wrote serials and was paid by the word, and that contributed a lot to his verbosity and rambling in his stories. It wasn't bad. Like, Dickens is a phenomenal writer and is still very engaging to read. Like, he wrote serials, so they had to be gripping, and, like, chapter by chapter, people had to keep wanting to come back, and they did. But I don't know that Anne Rice's writing is served by some of the winding journeys that her sentences can take, and I think we'll save more of that for book club. But, like, that was another aspect to her writing that was, like, a little... It made climbing the wall to get through it a little bit harder, and it took a while before I really got into interview. She also literally doxed herself in that comment. Amazon had to take that down. There are multiple accounts of Anne Rice attacking people for negative reviews and even pushing her fan base to go after them. Like, I found an entire blog that was dedicated to just archiving Anne Rice responding to Facebook comments. And, like, it's all a lot of stuff like that, you know? If it's not a giant thing, it's like one really haughty sentence or something. It is unprofessional, it's childish, and there is not enough room in any coffin for Anne Rice's ego.
It kind of reminds me of what happened with Addison Kane and the ABO lawsuit. If you don't know anything about the ABO lawsuit, that's actually our 3rd and 4th episodes, so you'd have to scroll all the way to the beginning. But very similar sentiment, very, hey fans, attack this person for me because I don't like what they said. And there's something deeply wrong about you being a person with power and then sicking your fans.
Oh, absolutely.
These people. It's so, and I know for the most part, it's kind of like in good fun, like voting for a fan award or something like that on social media. But unfortunately, people have been attacked. People, I mean, clearly from what we're
People
seeing,
have been killed.
people have
Like,
been
we
killed.
can acknowledge that. People have died from swatting attempts, you know?
Yeah.
Or I guess, like, actual SWAT attacks, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
I think the only time, if you have any sort of large following, that it's appropriate for you to, like, quote unquote rally your fan base is, like, when it's either to, like, you know, send letters, emails, and phone calls to government representatives or to go help and support people.
Yeah.
But doing this thing where you're like, go bother so-and-so, or like, go mass report this person. You know, obviously there are things where it's like, hey, could I get everyone's help in mass reporting this individual because they're doing things that are like genuinely unethical? That's one thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, this whole thing of like, these people wrote mean reviews about me. This reporter wrote a column in the paper about me because I bought a chapel and he doesn't like what I'm planning to do with it. You know, everybody please go harass him at his personal phone number. Like, no, that's absolutely not okay.
Don't do that.
And I mean, there are accounts of her digging through Facebook to find information on people to leverage against them in these arguments and demands for their phone numbers, their real names, their addresses. Like, she wants to dox people. I don't think she understands how bad doxing is. And, like,
fucked up.
Doxing didn't have quite the same fear laced through it and intertwined with it for a very long time like it does today. But it is still a huge overstep and violation at any point in internet history to, like, seek personal private information about someone that they haven't made readily accessible to the public. And when I say readily accessible, I mean, like, on the front page. Like, I knew of an individual who once went digging through the internet to find a voice actor's old resume to get a hold of his address that he had on it so that they could send him a package. And it was like, this is not okay. Like, that is a huge overstep. That's totally inappropriate.
Ooh, I don't like that. Oh my god, that freaks me out big time.
I mentioned earlier about Anne Rice sending cease and desist to fanfic writers that they actually worked with. Let's circle back to that.
Okay.
So, Tumblr user TBQ shared that they, among many other fic writers, often worked hand in hand with Anne and her team to promote the Vampire Chronicles, just because they loved it so much, which is like, that's really amazing to like not only be acknowledged by the creator of this thing that you love so much, but like to get to work to help promote it. Like, that's awesome. These events occurred prior to the 2000 banning of Anne Rice fanfiction, just so we're clear about that in timeline-wise. TBQ left a part-time web job because they wanted to profit off of Vampire Chronicles fanfic. So, like, there was a huge respect among the fan base for respecting Anne and her wishes and, you know, like, trying to protect her work and keep other people from profiting off of it. So Anne Rice, during that period, got back certain rights to her characters, which would allow for her to profit from them in different ways. Her fans had created the Talismanic Tour Company, which worked with Anne and her biographer to create walking tours of New Orleans. And, like, New Orleans is a huge set piece in the Vampire Chronicles. Anne Rice lived there for many, many years. Those tours were incredibly successful, and they had Anne Rice's blessing. And then she served the Talismanic Tour Company a cease and desist and created her own tours with higher prices.
Boo.
Those tours, because of the extreme hike in pricing, failed.
Greedy.
Absolutely. And terrible. Like,
Yikes.
You used your fans for market research, took advantage of them, and then slapped them with legal. Like, that's terrible.
That's really, that's deeply troubling for me.
But, like, that stoked a huge fear in the fandom of doing any sort of work even with her because she could turn around and threaten legal action against them. And it's like, you're poisoning your own fan base against you. And it's the fan base that made you and, like, really helped to proliferate and promote your work. That's terrible.
Yeah.
After that event in 1997, are you prepared for what is possibly my favorite piece of Anne Rice history?
Yes, I would love to hear.
So, in 1997, Anne got into an aggressive fight with Al Copeland. Do you know who Al Copeland is?
Is he the creator of Popeye's Chicken?
Hell yeah!
Yeah, boy!
So, in Memnoch the Devil, which is Anne Rice's one book, Lestat walks into this abandoned car lot and looks at his reflection in the windows of a car. But the lot was then purchased, like the real life lot was purchased, and Copeland built a restaurant there. It was not Popeyes, but it was a Cajun and California cuisine restaurant. She did not like how it was decorated.
Oh
She thought it was hideous and garish and tacky. And she and Copeland went back and forth taking out thousands of dollars in full-page ads in the daily newspaper to snipe at each other.
Can you imagine Anne Rice just sitting, arms crossed, water untouched, food untouched, sitting at this table looking around like, this is fucking ugly. I hate this place.
Well, so the funnier part, according to fans, is that, like, they saw her house and it was, like, the tackiest thing in the world, like, animal print everywhere. Like, do you know, okay, so you know in Queen of the Damned, when they go to Lestat's one, like, place that he's staying for the night, and there are these two massive leopard print couches,
yes,
and they're like...
I have not seen that movie in years, but yes, I do.
They're like, they have, like, metal gilded edges, and they're, like, Baroque, but with animal print. Copeland began joking about how Lestat was in his restaurant then, and he wasn't going to give him back. He was like,
this is just us having Twitter beef together with each other.
He's like, I didn't, plan on purchasing a vampire, but he's in the restaurant now, and you can't have him.
Lestat is in between the dirt and the foundation of the restaurant. There is a Lestat-shaped, like, bump in the flooring in the back room. Han
Solo style. Yeah, I heard if you go to this one restaurant in New Orleans, you can piss on Tom Cruise's face. Oh, buddy, I own the restaurant, and every day they won't even let me piss on Tom Cruise's face.
Okay.
The Times-Picayune, which was the, newspaper, ran a poll to see who people sided with, and 3-1 they sided with Al Copeland.
I love that for him.
People in New Orleans really didn't seem to like Anne Rice, and I think a lot of her, like, buying up local real estate and monuments to, quote-unquote restore them or things to, make cash grabs, and, like, I can understand that. Like, this... It's a weird mix where it's like, okay, yeah, she might be interested in, like, preserving the quote-unquote spirit of New Orleans, but, like, she's doing it for her own profit, and that's the part of it that I think a lot of people don't like. In 2012, Anne Rice does seem to have revised her opinions on fanfiction, and she's much more generous now. She said, I don't ever want to read about my characters in someone else's writing. It's too upsetting for me because they are mine and from my mind. I never read fanfiction. Other writers feel differently about it and are happy and encouraging of it. I don't make judgments. I prefer to ignore it. But if 50 Shades of Grey grew out of that, well, there are no rules. Books can come out in any variety of ways. And later that year, she also said, I got upset about 20 years ago because I thought it would block me. She says, however, it's been very easy to avoid reading any, so live and let live. If I were a young writer, I'd want to write my own ideas. But maybe fanfiction is a transitional phase. Whatever gets you there, gets you there. It's like, I think that is maybe the most we'll get out of her. And, like, that's okay. Anne Rice is 79 years old now, you know? I could go on and on about Anne Rice because it was just like there's so many tiny little fights that have happened over the years, but like these kind of seem to be the big capstones, and I think really portray like the weird sort of fear she struck in fandom for a very long time, and like that still lasts, but like there are people now who don't understand why there are disclaimers on fanfiction, and like it's largely because of Anne Rice. There are also issues with, like, the X-Files fandom and Fox and NBC, but, like, Anne Rice was a huge part of it because her team was so litigious and so aggressive about it. And, like, full-out doxing people, threatening them, digging up personal information. Like, it made people feel unsafe.
Yeah.
Do you have any final thoughts, Tease?
I think Lestat lives in Anne Rice's mind palace, and one day that mind palace will crumble.
Mm-hmm.
And then he'll be free for all of us to use. When Anne Rice dies,
when
Lestat
enters the common domain.
Lestat will be in the common domain. He's going to be in my new vampire romance, which is just Great Gatsby. But Lestat is Gatsby. We are going whole hog.
That kind of works, though.
It does.
That kind of works.
Welcome to my Vampire Great Gatsby recreation. That'd actually be big sexy.
It would be.
Let's write it.
No.
No.
Speaking of idea theft, if any listeners want to take that one's up. Go grab it.
That one's free. That one's on the house, boys. Just make sure you promote us, the podcast, on your press tour.
Disclaimer: I don't own Gatsby or Lestat or this idea. Author's note: don't like, don't listen. Came up with it.
I own author's note. Don't like, don't listen. It's me. I'm the one who made the name.
You did.
I did. Anyway. Cass, where can we find you online?
Nope, we're not there yet. If you enjoyed the podcast, maybe, share us with a friend, give us a like on social media, check us out, share us around. That really helps us out. We are on YouTube too. I know quite a few of you listen over. More people listen on YouTube than anywhere else, which is kind of startling. We're going to work on getting like a nicer thing for you to look at to listen over there.
Get us a silver play button. I want that silver play button. I want to hang it up in my bathroom so bad I could taste it.
But yeah, maybe if you don't even listen to us on YouTube, subscribe to us on YouTube. Seriously though, huge thank you for listening and checking out the podcast. It has already been so amazing and startling, like the amount of support we have gotten, and we cannot thank you enough for that. It's amazing. Like we said, we're going to do a book club episode talking about Interview with the Vampire, what it was like reading it, our thoughts and feelings on it. That will be available to all patrons $1 and up. Mm-hmm. But for patrons $5 and up, we also do a monthly bonus episode where we just talk about things that we really love. It's called Show and Tell. Consider joining us on Patreon. If Patreon's not your deal, but you really enjoyed the episode or really enjoy the work we do, consider maybe donating on Ko-fi. That's Ko-Fi. We are Author's Note Pod on both of those platforms. And if you want to find more information about us, reach out to us. We are available at authorsnotepod.com and everywhere across the internet, basically, at authorsnotepod. If you want to find more of me, in particular, in my forays into finding the trapped visage of Lestat in that New Orleans restaurant and peeing on its face, you can find me pretty much everywhere at Valhethella. That's VALHETHELLA. Where can people find more of you?
You can find me on Twitter at Vicunad. That's VICUNAD. And that's also my Instagram, but I never update my Instagram. You could also follow us on Instagram. But our theme music was done by James Yaiullo, and you could find him on Bandcamp under James Y. Cass, who did our theme music? No, fuck.
James Yaiullo did our theme music.
Thank you. Who did our cover photo?
Our cover art is done by the wonderful Nyalius. You can find her on Twitter at Nyalius. It's NYALLIEST. We were all screaming the other night because Bunny Boys got fucking confirmed for Endwalker.
Congratulations,
Hell yeah.
Final Fantasy 14. Are you winning?
Until next time, everybody, stay safe, wear your masks, and fucking Bunny Boys. Hell yeah.
Let's go, Bunny Boys, let's go.
Bye.
Bye.